optimism in the Brexit talks. It follows that deal on Friday, which allows negotiations to move forward to discuss the future relationship between Britain and the EU. But the nature of that future relationship is likely to become the focus of fierce domestic debate in the coming weeks and months. The Cabinet will begin its discussions later this month. And further across the political spectrum, there is a wide range of opinion. David Davis said yesterday the UK government wants to secure a Canada plus free trade deal after the UK leaves the EU. Canada's deal with the EU eliminates 98% of the tariffs between the EU and Canada, without the country paying for access to the single market. But unlike the Canada deal, David Davis wants financial services, which account for a substantial part of Britain's output, to be included in the tariff-free area. But some Brexiteers are unhappy. Leave means leaves. Richard Tice says the government risks diluting or giving away the opportunities of Brexit. He says the UK should be forging new trade deals with third-party countries, deregulating EU laws and creating a fairer immigration system. Meanwhile, Labour's Brexit spokesman Keir Starmer says the UK should stay aligned to the EU after Brexit and could negotiate payments to access the single market, as Norway does now. Asked if that would include allowing free movement of people, he said he would support an easy movement of people. The Shadow Foreign Secretary Emily Thornberry raised the possibility yesterday that the UK could stay in a form of customs union after Brexit to allow trade to continue between the EU and UK. While the SNP have called on Labour to get behind them and commit to stay in the single market and customs union. Well, our political correspondent Chris Mason joins me now. So, Chris, sufficient progress was made on Friday, but there's an awful lot to get through before it's rubber-stamped this Friday.
Yeah. There is. So this morning, first thing was a cabinet meeting. There's only one more after today before the end of the year. And yes, there is that big discussion to come about the end state, exactly what the cabinet wants in terms of what the flavour of Brexit turns out to be once we have left in the end of March of the year after next. Then this afternoon, that appointment that the Prime Minister has in front of the House of Commons. She was hoping to have done it last week, before that aborted lunch of turbot with Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the European Commission, and then a few days of frantic diplomacy and not a lot of sleep, and then that dash back to Brussels in the early hours of Friday morning. But a pretty triumphant tone, I suspect, from the Prime Minister this afternoon and from some around her, because it could have been very, very different, couldn't it? We could have either been talking today about how the whole thing had unravelled and gone pear-shaped and it was a nightmare for the Prime Minister, with all of the talk about what that might mean for her future or lack of it, or that there was days to go until the summit and a deal still hadn't been done and all that kind of stuff. Instead, the Prime Minister will say that, yes, we're going to have a game of Brexit bingo again. We're going to hear those phrases, hard and soft Brexit. Prime Minister saying it's not about either of those things. Our good old friend, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. But, she says, a new sense of optimism about the talks in the new year as discussion about the future relationship, trade and security and that kind of thing becomes the focus in 2018.
How is she going to keep everybody on board when everybody has a different view and opinion of what that end state, in terms of the future trade relationship, should actually look like? And also, tell us briefly about the EU withdrawal bill, which is back in the Commons.
Yeah, therein lies the challenge in terms of keeping everyone on board. I guess the flip side to that is that if you're in Downing Street, one thing you can marvel at in terms of the achievements of the other day was managing to come up with a document that Brussels was willing to sign off on, Dublin was willing to sign off on, Belfast, in the shape of the DUP, was willing to sign off on, and the various wings in terms of European instinct within the Conservative Party were willing to live with as well. Obviously, once we start getting into that discussion about the future relationship, and ultimately it boils down to how close or otherwise the UK in the future will be to the European Union, the other side of Brexit, then there is going to be a range of views and there's going to be a range of arguments, no doubt. As far as the withdrawal bill is concerned, that continues. It's trundling through the House of Commons. Huge amounts of detail to go through in terms of all of that. The government will hope that the prospect of any defeats there have been limited by something that falls into the category, I was told last week by one MP, of being important but boring, or boring but important. This is this whole business of the Procedure Committee and the proposed Sifting Committee, bear with me, the idea being that there can be a lot more scrutiny of what are known as statutory instruments, some of the little tools that are being used to push through one heck of a lot of detail in that withdrawal bill.
Right, well, I'm glad you're across it all, Chris Mason. Thank you very much for joining us. Here in the studio is the Westminster leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford, and from Central Lobby, the Conservative MP, Bernard Jenkin, who was on the board of the official Leave campaign group Vote Leave. Dawn Butler and Andrew Mitchell, of course, are also still here. Ian Blackford, first of all, you have made a pitch to Labour to join you in committing the UK to remaining in the customs union and the single market. Why?
Really, because it's about protecting jobs and investment in the United Kingdom. We know that if we're out with the single market and the customs union, it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of jobs throughout the UK.
But why have you made this pitch now to Labour?
Because I think there's a growing concern as to where we may end up as we go into stage 2. And what I'm asking is Labour and the other opposition parties to get behind us, and also with Conservative MPs that have real concerns about being out with the single market and the customs union.
Right.
Nobody voted to be poorer. And what I would say to Dawn, what I'd say to others, is that we need to make sure that we protect the interests of our constituents. And that's why remaining in the single market and the customs union is so important.
Well, do you accept that overture from the SNP?
Well, I think the position that the Labour Party has taken from the very beginning has been right, and we've been proven to be right.
What is it? What is the position?
In regards to us having a transitional arrangement and transitional deal, and having a bespoke deal when it comes to the customs union. And I think sometimes we forget that because it was well over a year ago that Labour's position at the very beginning has been proven to be right. And if
right, but are you accepting? My question is: are you accepting the SNP's invitation to stay in the customs union, the single market, and campaign with them?
Right, so I understand what Ian's saying, but the thing is, what that would mean would be you'll be ignoring the referendum. And the Labour Party has no intention of ignoring the referendum, but what we've said is that we need to have not only this transitional arrangement, but we have to have a way to maintain the benefits of the customs union and the single market.
So what's the difference? Well, but what's the difference between your position and the SNP's position? Because as you've just said, Keir Starmer also, we want to retain the exact same benefits as if we were in the single market and the customs union and remain in a customs union. So essentially, what's the difference?
So the difference is basically how we talk about it, in essence, in terms of we might not be able to say we are still in, but if we maintain the benefits, then, you know...
Right, so you're going to call it something different, but essentially it's the same.
It's not that we're going to call it something different, it's just that once you leave the European Union, you can no longer be a part of the single market as it is, because you would have left.
Do you see any difference between your two positions?
Oh, yeah, there is, and I think we have to be very clear about the threat that there is to people, the threat to jobs, the threat to prosperity, as I said. Now, the point about this is, what the Tories have talked about before is coming out of the single market and the customs union. Labour have accepted that we need to have a transition deal. But the harsh reality is, through that transition deal, we are going to be in the single market and the customs union. The cliff edge still remains. What I'm trying to do is remove that threat that there is to jobs in Don's constituency, in my constituency, and up and down this country.
Right. Well,
nobody's voted to be poorer.
Right. Well, let's put the. You've just said that the government should expect to remain in the customs union, the single market, during their implementation period. Bernard Jenkin, do you agree with that? Is that your understanding?
Well, I'm listening with amazement, because the Labour Party actually stood on a platform at the last election that they respected the referendum result, which meant leaving the European Union, leaving the customs union and the single market. And they had some weasel words in their manifesto about trying to have the benefits of being in the single market and the customs union without actually being in it.
Right, so what's going to happen in the implementation period as far as the government's concerned?
What we're hearing now is actually the Labour Party has moved into a position they don't actually want us to leave the European Union. And the fact that Keir Starmer actually committed the Labour Party to a second referendum can only mean one thing: they're hoping to change the results. They're hoping to reverse the referendum decision. So the Conservative Party now is the only party, apart from the DUP, there are only these two parties in Parliament that actually want to honour the referendum result and deliver the freedom to control our own borders and our own borders and stop contributing money to the European Union.
Dawn Butler, are you committed, or can you rule out that Labour would ever support the idea of a second referendum?
Can I just say, the problem with what's just said is that David Davis has admitted that he doesn't have to be very bright to do his job and to be Brexit Secretary, and I think that's fundamentally what the problem... Yes, he did, and I think that's fundamentally what the problem is, because you do not only have to be very bright, but you have to be across the detail.
Right.
And that's been... That's been the problem with this negotiation.
So answer the question
from the very
answer me
beginning.
the question about the second referendum. Is Labour going to support the idea of a second referendum?
That's not something that we are considering at the moment.
But you might.
But as Keir has said, there's nothing off the table, and it's a sensible approach to negotiations. And this is the problem that we've had with this government in terms of having red lines, and after a year and a half, having to then row back because they hadn't considered the detail. And that's the problem.
Bernard Jenkins, how do you envisage Britain's future relationship beyond Brexit in terms of trade?
Well, actually, the idea that the Cabinet's never discussed any of this, the position was set out in the manifesto that we're leaving the EU, we're leaving the customs union, we're leaving the single market, and we're going to be in a position to do meaningful trade deals with non-EU countries. And that means we have to have regulatory autonomy, because most trade deals are not about negotiating about tariffs. That's the icing on the cake to get rid of the tariffs. Most trade deals are about dismantling the non-tariff barriers.
Right, so you do want to see regulatory autonomy.
Absolutely.
How worried are you about the idea that if a deal isn't done, there will be full alignment of the UK being tied closely to the EU standards and customs in order to maintain that open border with Ireland?
Well, we've clearly made a commitment to Ireland and to the EU that we want alignment, but every trade deal starts out with discussion about you've got to align with us and we've got to align with you.
Right.
The advantage of this discussion about our trade deal with the EU is we already have complete alignment, and the alignment in Northern Ireland is confined purely to the matters that pertain to the North-South cooperation and the support of the agreement.
Right.
In any
so
case,
how would you feel?
This text will form part of a much bigger text, the withdrawal agreement, and it is the withdrawal agreement as a whole that will have legally binding effect. This text on its own has no legal binding effect.
Oh, right. So this is a statement of intent, as David Davis said, which upset the Irish government.
Well, I mean, I think the Irish hoisted the Jolly Roger and then had to pull it down again.
Are you saying this agreement is not worth the paper it's written on before it's even been given? Well, you've just said it's not binding in any way.
Well, it is an agreement to move to the main phase of the negotiations, which is long overdue. And the fact that the EU almost begged Theresa May to make an agreement, I think, shows what a strong position the United Kingdom is in, and that we should stick to our guns. We should not finish up where Labour and the Liberal Democrats and the SNP now want this country to be. Right. Outside the European Union, unable to influence the decisions made, unable to influence the court, but subject to the court and all the rules and all the costs, and unable to do trade deals with the other countries outside the EU.
Well,
that's the worst of all possible worlds.
Well, why is it that Richard Tice, then, from Leave Means Leave, says it's a total capitulation, this deal, that, in his words, the UK is paying far more that they're not actually legally bound to do in order to move on to phase two, that they have signed up to an arrangement where the UK could be tied for a generation to the EU in terms of customs and in terms of standards. There won't be the divergence that you have talked about, that the European Court of Justice will have jurisdiction, certainly over the rights of EU citizens during the implementation period and possibly beyond. Do you regard that as a success?
Well, that is not the government's position. Perhaps he's listening too much to the European Union and the Remainers and the SNP and the Labour Party.
I thought you supported Leave Means Leave.
I've never been... well, I am a supporter of Leave Means Leave, but I don't agree with Richard on this point.
Right. Why not? In terms of
if I can get a word in edgeways,
go on then,
please.
you finish.
Well, the point is, this is merely moving us to the next phase of the negotiations. We are now starting a free trade negotiation with the EU. As I say, both sides are setting out their positions on each side. There will have to be compromise, as there was compromise between Canada and the EU. But to finish up with a Canada plus and able to be able to do trade deals with the United States, or even be able to perhaps participate in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has been abandoned by the United States, which would welcome British participation.
All right.
You know, we've got huge opportunities, and we mustn't throw these opportunities
All right, let me come to Andrew
by
Mitchell.
still being a prisoner of the EU.
Right. Do you think Britain is going to be a prisoner of the EU in the way Bernard Jenkins has outlined? Would you like to see the UK closely aligned to the single market and the customs union?
Well, let's be clear where we are today. First of all, we have reached first base successfully. We had a difficult week last week, but it ended with a triumph for the Prime Minister, and we can now advance towards the second phase. And my dispute with all my colleagues who've spoken on this programme so far is that I think they are slightly jumping the gun. I think the key thing is to get into these negotiations. Canada plus sounds to me like a very good starting point for the British negotiations. And at the end of the day, of course we're going to have a transition period, otherwise...
Within the single market and the customs union?
A transition period we're going to have, otherwise business won't be able to plan and make the necessary changes that will be required. But the key thing to me is to let the negotiator, who is doing an extremely good job, get on with negotiating the best position for Britain.
Is that David Davis?
It is David
Well, Dawn
Davis.
Butler said he's not very bright.
Well, I beg to differ.
It's his own words. It's his own words. It's his own words.
He's got a brain like a steel trap. He's extremely bright. But let the negotiator get on with negotiating the best deal for Britain. And that is not either a hard or a soft Brexit. It's the best deal for Britain, the whole of Britain, and that's what I now want to see us advance towards.
Do you see this moving on to phase 2 as a statement of intent? It's not binding in any way?
Well, certainly the principle that has been outlined is binding, absolutely.
Right, so you disagree with Bernard Jenkins there, that it's all up for grabs?
No, Bernard is quite rightly giving a technical appreciation, but what I'm saying is that when the British government put up that point, which secured agreement across the piece, that principle is certainly binding.
Do you see the UK's future relationship as one that will be closely mirroring the European Union in terms of rules and regulations?
I see the primacy, the absolute importance of a free trade deal as overruling all of that. That, by definition, means alignment to some extent, but a free trade deal is absolutely essential for both of us.
What, in your mind, Dawn Butler, does easy movement of people mean?
It means that some people are saying, well, are you signed up to no movement? No, we're not signed up to no movement. There has to be movement.
Sure.
And
but
so
an end to freedom of movement is what the Labour manifesto said. So what does Keir Starmer mean when he says easy movement?
Well, that is something that he will then develop in terms of detail. But the question he was answering...
so he hasn't actually thought through what this is.
The question that he was answering was, are we saying there's no movement? And Keir was saying that it's impossible to say there's no movement because we will need movement in people in order for us to...
Well,
for our
everyone's
economy
accepted that,
to thrive. So we will need movement of people, but it won't look exactly as it looks now. So there would be more stringent regimes around it in terms of how people are monitored.
Well, will there be a cap on
out.
numbers, for example?
Oh, we never talk about caps and numbers.
OK, so there won't be a cap of numbers. Could it mean an unlimited number of EU migrants coming to the UK?
I think, to be honest, that's part of the negotiation stance and details. If we were around the negotiating table, that we could come back with more detail. And that's the kind of questions that you really should be asking David Davis and the government in terms of what their plans are.
Do you see in Blackford, in the coming months, that actually Labour will move its position to saying we should remain in the single market and the customs union, and then the two of you can forge a closer relationship on Brexit?
Yes, that has to happen, because it has to be about protecting the interests of our constituents. And
are you talking to Labour at the moment?
I wrote to Jeremy Corbyn yesterday, so I'm waiting for a reply. I've said that we should sit down and meet. But, you know, the fundamentals of this, if we're in a situation that everyone seems to accept that there's going to be alignment with the rules of the EU, the situation that we're in today is that there will be no border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. We now know, on the basis of the intervention of the DUP, there's going to be no border between the island of Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. The only way you can square this is by staying in the single market and the customs union. The hard Brexiteers have taken the country up a blind alley, and it hasn't worked. They're simply going to have to accept that staying in the single market and the customs union is the only logical way of resolving
Well,
this.
I mean, Bernard Jenkins, what you said, the final word, Bernard Jenkins, will you and do you still think Britain should pay for its obligations that it said it would honour, even if you don't get the trade deal you like?
Well, we have no obligations. We would like to offer the EU some money as a goodwill gesture for leaving the European Union midway during a budget period, and that's reasonable enough. But just two very quick points. There was never going to be a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic.
Well, that's not what the Irish government thought.
Well, if they wanted to have one, that would be up to them. We were never going to have one. If they want to put infrastructure there, that's up to them. And actually, it would never happen. It was all a bluff. It was all a nonsense. And because you don't need to police the border at the border in order to police the border with technology these days. And the second thing about alignment. Alignment isn't a yes-no question. Andrew is completely right. In any free trade deal, there are degrees of alignment. The point is, under the new arrangements, when we leave the EU, we will control what we choose to align with the EU instead of being dictated.
Well, you say that. Well, we'll have to see. At the moment, it doesn't sound like that. It sounds like
that's your
could
opinion,
be made.
Joe. That's your opinion.
No, I think that's the opinion that has been expressed by many people, but the term was used.
Well, obviously you're on their side.
Pardon?
You're obviously on their side.
Whose side?
Well, you said you agree with them.
No.
You just did.
I just said the view that was expressed. Anyway, we'll have to continue this another time. But Bernard Jenkins, thank you. By The Telegraph's Kate McCann and Politico's Jack Blanchard. Welcome to both of you. Kate McCann, first of all, it is a busy week, and there has been some expectation that it'll be difficult to keep everyone on board before the deal is rubber-stamped on Friday. Where do you think the areas of concern would be for the government?
Well, I think we will see where those areas of concern are over the course of today, actually, because Theresa May is chairing her cabinet meeting this morning. There have been some conversations already over the weekend about concern, particularly David Davis yesterday on Andrew Marr about the Northern Ireland aspect of the agreement that was made last week. And then we'll see her face MPs in the House of Commons later, and I would be surprised
how much it is aligned with all the rules and regulations they have in Europe, or how much we in the sort of Brexiteer parlance go our own way. And this is a huge debate that is raging in government now, has been for a few weeks. It's just about to explode onto the surface in the cabinet, which is very divided on this. And it really is long-term future of the nation stuff. And so people like Bernard Jenkins are very much trying to push Theresa May in a certain direction that Britain will give a clean break with Europe and go off into the world and set its own rules and regulations about all sorts of different things. But of course what that will do is limit how easily we can sell products into the EU single market, which is currently our biggest market. And so it's a hugely important issue that no one's really started to debate, or only just starting to debate now. And I think we're going to hear a lot about these long, boring terms about regulatory alignment over the next few months.
So we better get used to them. I mean, Kate McCann, in terms of this statement of intent, I mean, David Davis, the Brexit Secretary himself, seemed to cast doubt on how binding the agreement actually was, this idea that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Does that make it more difficult to keep everyone together until Friday?
Well, I think we'll see the Prime Minister repeat that again today and say nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And there is a reason for that. It's exactly as you say, actually, that they want to be able to give themselves enough leeway because they know that the divisions on these issues, just as Jack's just said, are so huge that it's impossible to tie them down. So what we saw with the DUP last week, I think we'll see again over the course of the negotiations, is an issue is pushed and pushed and pushed until the last minute when people really kick off about it, but in quite a short space of time, because there is a deadline for agreement. It's not in the Prime Minister's interest to open up this can of worms and really talk it through in the open early, because the earlier you do that, the earlier it exposes these huge chasms in opinion. And on trade, particularly in the Cabinet, it's going to be really difficult to bridge those. So I think you'll see Theresa May try and keep it as open as you can, and that's what David Davis was doing over the weekend, although it looks like he probably went a little bit too far, because actually as soon as you start saying it's really open, the Irish government says, you know, well, that's not what we want to hear, and that's very problematic for us. So they're trying a balancing act of keeping everybody in the boat without tipping too far one way so that they then have to drag people back over the side. It's very complicated, but I think we'll see this tactic again and again.
True. And it's very interesting, David Davis this morning very much backtracking on how far he went on the Marr show yesterday. Clearly went too far, suggested that none of this really means anything. The Irish government's gone bananas, understandably, and of course, you know, this still hasn't been signed off. The European Commission have agreed it, but Theresa May's got this big summit on Thursday when the 27 other countries in the EU have to sign it off. So for her government to be saying, actually, it's not worth the paper it's written on, it's not really a smart tactic 4 days ahead of that summit.
Right, let's